Up next, we have a thought leadership spotlight titled Understand Skills, Unlock Talent. And our speakers will be Carly Ackerman, Director of Customer Experience, and Jason Cerrato, who is Senior Director of Product Marketing. They're both from Eightfold. In today's discussion, Carly and Jason will explain how, with a skills-based approach to work, HR leaders can spend less time searching for the right people and more time designing a workforce with future skills, thereby unlocking the potential of their workforce and opening doors for untapped talent. So thank you so much for joining us today, Carly and Jason. Now take it away.
Thanks so much. And I just want to confirm that we're ready to go and folks can see the screen.
Yes,
great.
Indeed.
All right, Jason, I'm going to let you get us kicked off.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for the folks joining us today. As mentioned, my name is Jason Cerrato, former HR leader, industry analyst, and now I work on the product team for Eightfold. Today, we'll be discussing the use of skills as the connective through line for everything talent, as well as walking you through some of the internal and external forces driving this need for change. And finally, we'll land on some recommendations for what HR can do to deploy skill-based talent strategies. And as mentioned, I'm joined today by my colleague, Carly Ackerman. Carly, you want to say hello?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Carly Ackerman. I work on our customer success team here at Eightfold. I have about 7 years of experience in the human capital and workforce transformation space and a background in public education. So I was really excited to hear the previous session as well. Jason?
So let's start by giving away the answer first. You know, skills are the through line connecting all aspects of the employee life cycle. They contribute tangibly to key milestones and activities in the standard talent life cycle. They also facilitate and enable the more intangible components of the total talent experience. You know, creating inclusive career experiences with equitable outcomes for all, facilitating access and exposure for internal and external opportunities, and driving long-term employee engagement. But how do we operationalize this? You know, this was a question that was asked at the end of the previous session. So things are aligning very well. And, you know, what do we stand to lose or risk if we don't do this? You know, one of the things that we believe here at Eightfold very strongly is that AI gives you the power to take skills beyond the job. And projects and activities and learning opportunities that tie into the broader experience of an individual throughout their career. So, you know, we as individuals are more than our role, and we need to pay attention to everything else, you know, that happens at work. We probably have all different names for the process steps that compromise the talent lifecycle, but we're providing a simplified view here. You know, attract, develop, engage, transition, and within that lifecycle, there are a number of touch points between the organization and the employee. And in many of your organizations, they may take a different shape of who's involved and who may touch them, but for the most part, these generally fall under the umbrella of HR. And as we look at kind of building out a skills-based approach for organizations, it's really important to leverage advanced technologies like AI to really identify and uncover skills in organizational roles, as well as individuals' capabilities and talent profiles. Because as mentioned here, we are much more than our role. And organizations historically have been tracking skills based on the job someone's doing for the organization. But people develop skills in a variety of ways through things like projects, activities, and learning opportunities. And by getting better visibility to the skills that are required and the skills that people have, you know, it's a way for a skills-based organization to be more nimble, adaptable, and responsive, especially as business needs change and fluctuate very quickly. So I wanted to hand it over to Carly to talk about some of the forces that are acting on organizations kind of leading to this change.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And as Jason mentioned, one of the things we wanted to focus on today are not just the internal forces that you're probably feeling within your own organizations, but also external forces that are pressuring organizations to really re-examine their approach to talent strategies. So I know we have 6 here. Today, we're going to focus just on 4, just given the time. So we're going to double click on organizational complexity, expanded role of the leader, the organization as a social safety net, and the war to fill the skills gap. So first, we wanted to talk about the fact that we're seeing increased organizational complexity. We're seeing much wider use of contingent workers, broader adoption of hybrid workforce practices, and we're even seeing some fully remote workforce designs. What we're not really seeing is organizations prepare their managers to support and nurture workers in this totally new environment. And several months ago, I had the privilege of attending the Irresistible conference hosted by the Josh Bersin Company, and you'll see a lot of their research reflected here as well. And their research pointed to the fact that we've really arrived at a point on the future of work timeline where organizations aren't just upskilling their workforces to deliver on new business objectives. They're actually weathering entire industry evolutions. The industries are changing completely underneath the organizations themselves. So before we move to our next force, Jason, I know that you've done a lot of research on this idea of liquid talent. I'm thinking that liquid talent is something that should really help organizations navigate some of these changes, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you've been hearing in the research that you've done.
So, very appropriately in the session right before this, we heard from Walmart mentioning deconstructing jobs to redo job descriptions. We're definitely seeing organizations deconstructing jobs into skills, allowing them to be more nimble and agile. But we're also seeing organizations deconstruct jobs to get work done with a combination of people who offer a combination of skills rather than wait to find that one person who has all 15 skills needed for this one role and taking months to find that individual. It allows organizations to respond to needs more quickly. It also allows for the development of teams more broadly, as well as just greater exposure for who's already on the team and could potentially be upskilled or reskilled and redeployed into other areas. So we're definitely seeing this kind of force of project teams being used to fill organizational gaps, with skills being that connective tissue for identifying both sides of those initiatives. We're definitely also seeing that contingent talent and more concepts of total workforce management approaches coming under HR's responsibility. In the past, there's always been this kind of separation, and it was important for people to know about it, but things were kind of kept at an arm's length. I see more and more kind of this build, buy, borrow, and even in the future, bot scenario and strategy planning coming more under HR's purview.
Awesome. So the second internal force that we wanted to focus on today was the expanded role of the leader. So in light of some of the other internal forces, the ones that we talked about, one that we might not get to today, it's likely not surprising that the number of skills that a leader is expected to have has grown tremendously, and the role itself has evolved just to take on a lot more scope within an organization. So again, Jason, I know succession planning has been top of mind for you. I'd love for you to talk us through some of the findings that you've seen as it relates to, what's really top of mind for leaders as they're thinking through, my role is going to become exponentially bigger over time, and I need to make sure that I have the right pipeline behind me to fill that role, knowing that it's going to evolve probably by the time I'm ready to leave it.
So I think, you've set up a great discussion on this topic with a couple of things you've already presented. The expanding role of leader, the rapid pace of change, the shifting of industries and pivoting of organizations into entirely new areas. It's definitely putting a lot of stress and demand on developing individuals, but also just expediting the pace of change with the roles and skills that leaders have to obtain. As a former analyst, we used to publish reports every year on which were the top 25 most in-demand roles for the year. And when you think about it, 15 of the top 25 most in-demand roles didn't exist 15 years ago. And that pace of change is even getting faster and faster. The same goes for executive roles and for leadership roles. Think about it. Think, only a few years back, were we hearing about chief experience officers or chief sustainability officers or chief innovation officers or chief privacy officers? There's a whole new area growing across the C-suite as businesses change, as the way we deliver to customers change, and as the way we support employees change. You mentioned Josh Bersin. He has this concept he talks about with T-shaped careers. where you go deep in an area and kind of broad in business. And I think we're seeing more and more this demand for T-shaped leaders, right? Earlier this year here at Eightfold, we conducted a research study across 260 HR leaders and 1,000 employees. And when the topic of succession planning, as you mentioned, came up, although the respondents shared that identifying high-performing employees to promote internally was a key priority, they also shared with us that 64% of them identified succession planning primarily focused on just the top of the organization. They also shared that 44% of them were only engaging in succession planning once a year, right? So these are important things to consider in how we reshape HR and how we work for the future, because if roles are changing and expanding more rapidly, and only 40% of roles will be over 40% of roles will be significantly different within 5 years, as shared on this slide. If you aren't going deep enough into the organization with your succession planning or with your skills analysis, you're likely missing the emerging skills that you should be tracking. And if you're only engaging in planning once a year, and jobs are changing so fast that in less than 5 years they will look very different, you only have 2 or 3 cycles to identify and plan and get it right before the profile may change completely. So it's definitely a new day in HR for a lot of these talent practices.
Right. And I think it's interesting to think about succession beyond just the scope of the C-level, right? Especially as some of the C-level roles that you mentioned that did not exist prior also require entire teams below them to be able to actually support the work of that C-level executive. So really interesting to see the idea of succession kind of cascading down throughout the organization as well. All right, so we're going to shift to the external forces. Starting first here, we wanted to talk about how the research is really suggesting that workers are seeing organizations in a completely new light. I think we can probably all identify with this. I would say coming out of COVID, whether you agree with the timing of that or not. There's this new idea that an organization is serving as a social safety net in the wake of just several years of economic, political, and social disruption. We don't have time to really get into the crisis response external force that's here at the bottom of the slide, but suffice it to say, these two are very tightly linked. And involved in both is a huge element of trust. And I feel like across every webinar I've been on, whether it's about skills-based organizations or it's been about employee engagement and experience, this idea of trust has become increasingly critical over the past year. Workers want to feel that they can trust their leaders and organizations with their well-being. And that means both in the workplace as well as out of the workplace. You can see how this easily translates into an expectation that an organization is not only going to care for the worker while they're there at work, whether spiritually or physically, but that they're also have in mind the well-being of that worker's family, knowing that families are now becoming increasingly involved in all aspects of a worker's life, including the work itself, when you've got your kid behind you on the Zoom call. So definitely seeing this expectation that the organization is kind of going to step in and provide additional supports in the wake of a very turbulent couple of years. So Jason, again, turning it to you, I'd love to hear if you've seen any examples of organizations that are leveraging technology and HR strategy as well, coupling the two together to deal with burnout, with issues of wellness or well-being, maybe even touching on inclusion as well.
Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of tools that have come out on the market focused on employee experience and well-being. Just last month, we had the opportunity to attend HR Tech, and there were 2 main topics of discussion across the HR Tech conference. It was tools for employee experience and well-being and tools for skills-based approaches and talent intelligence. And I think both of them are working together to address some of these issues here in terms of these external forces. From a skills perspective, what skills do in kind of this conversation, this challenge, is they help by increasing transparency and understanding of how people can grow their careers, what's expected of them, how they're measured, and maybe even how managers and leaders view and evaluate talent. And hopefully through this, find more ways to leverage everyone on their team. Using skills, organizations are helping to remove ambiguity, which often causes stress. and increase transparency and create better awareness of potential career paths within an organization, or even more importantly, like the requirements to obtain certain roles along those paths. And what I've seen is, this helps to both, as I've kind of phrased it, help people create aspirations, but also manage expectations. Because when people know what skills they need to acquire and better understand kind of what levels of proficiency they should have to be considered, it gives them more direction and more of a plan with better information for the potential opportunities they have to stay with this organization and grow. And it reduces the feeling that they are spinning their wheels when they think they're doing everything they should and they're not getting these opportunities, which creates frustration. It sounds obvious, but one of the strongest predictors of attrition is the alignment between someone's interests and their job. And when it comes to what's next for that person within an organization, more often than not, it's a matter of someone not knowing what opportunity was available or how they could be considered, rather than there actually being a misalignment. So I think part of this approach with skills, it helps create transparency, it helps create better visibility and awareness to team members. You mentioned around kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It also removes some of the barriers for how people are evaluated and considered for roles. I think that was also another topic that was mentioned in the session right before this. So by using skills as kind of that data point and common denominator, it potentially expands the audience for consideration, while better aligning people for what they could be considered for.
Awesome. Well, I know you and I can go on and on for days about skills. I'm going to move us pretty quickly through the last force that we wanted to cover, so that we can make sure folks walk away with some actionable next steps. So this final force that we have time for today is the one that precedes the pandemic, and it's probably going to outlive all of us. And that's the war on talent. It's not new at all. But we are certainly seeing an uptick in organizations who are extrapolating the problem to the level of skills. This idea of breaking work down into the actual components of what is the work that needs to get done versus specific jobs is allowing organizations to take a closer look at those skills that are really the fungible currency of talent and how they can better match workforce supply and work demand. So what we're seeing is that employees who feel that their skills are not being put to good use, as you mentioned, in their current job, they're 10 times more likely to go looking elsewhere for a new job than those who feel that their skills are actually being put to good use. So I'm actually going to withhold the urge to ask you a question on this one, Jason, so that we can make sure that folks see what are some of the next steps that they can take to really start to move the needle on these new strains on organizations. So we wanted to offer up 5 actions that HR can take to leverage skills to unlock the workforce potential and to start to address the forces that are challenging the status quo. So first, you have to make skills understandable and actionable. We see a lot of organizations implement a tool or buy a skills ontology and think, voila, we've solved it, we've figured it out. This is a huge change management effort for HR, but it's also a huge change management effort for employees. They need to see their skills data. They need to see skills pop up in their work. They need to see that the work is being broken down, and they need to see how their skills are being tied to real value delivery for the organization. Skills have to be owned across the organization. For a time, it felt like pushing a boulder uphill to make a case for skills in terms of business value. But if there's anything that the war on tech talent recently has specifically taught us, it's that skills are critical to most businesses in terms of staying competitive in market. So find your business champions, demonstrate success in small pockets, and scale from there. With skills as the currency for talent, matching worker to opportunity, and with new AI-powered tools, we have what is needed to really enable internal mobility. But as I mentioned before, buying the shiny tool is one thing, building a culture of mobility is another. Leaders can be tempted to hoard talent. We're seeing lots of organizations starting to implement incentive structures and real accountability among leaders to let their people grow and develop. And sometimes that really means letting your people go and move on to other opportunities. A close relative to internal mobility is the talent marketplace. So that's giving employees the opportunity to find everything from job opportunities to BRGs, learning opportunities, the types of things that will help them fill skills gaps. And this is how we start to democratize access to skill building opportunities and give workers the keys to their own careers. And before we drop off, throwing away all the way back to the original slide that Jason was walking you through, it's imperative that organizations embed skills throughout the entire talent lifecycle, all the way from hire to retire. Skills can and will become the fabric of an organization, tying the work, the culture, the value, everything together. And I think we are out of time, so please feel free to reach out to us. As I mentioned, we would love to talk further about this topic. We're very passionate and we appreciate the time today.
Well, thanks so much, Carly and Jason. Your presentation on talent intelligence was a perfect walk up to the next discussion, but we do have time for one more question before we start that one. And I was wondering if you could answer this one, which is, how can HR leaders influence the rest of the organization and the leadership team into helping them build a more skilled-based approach? Would one of you like to field that one?
You want me to start with that one? Okay. So it's a great question. We've had organizations that we've been partnering with use their HR leadership team to walk the talk, as Carly mentioned, where they were actually creating that kind of culture of internal mobility, and they were rotating roles and mirroring some of the behavior they were trying to influence. A more specific example is I was having a conversation with an HR leader where during kind of all this rapid change in their organization, the way they delivered to customers was entirely different. Their requirements to support digital transformation was entirely different. And what they did was they built these kind of project teams, deconstructing jobs, but also breaking down org charts and breaking down kind of leadership responsibility to become more of an agile, maybe horizontal organization. And as a result, in addition to being more responsive to the business challenges that were right in front of them, one of the things they benefited from was it created new visibility for individuals that may not have been seen before by additional leaders in other parts of the organization. So it created its own pull for generating promotion opportunities, visibility, expansion of roles, upskilling, simply from kind of changing some leadership behaviors to allow for some of these behaviors to occur.
Great. One just parting thing, just to define our terms one more time. How do you define the difference between skills, capabilities, and competencies?
I can jump in on that one, Jason.
Sure.
I think if you had asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said, well, you have to separate them all differently. They're very different units of measure. And while I still believe in that, I think that there's a much more fundamental issue that needs to be addressed, which is that an organization just needs to agree on their own terms. So I could define it for you, but I still think that it makes a lot more sense for each organization to come together from an HR and from a business perspective and say, this is what we mean by a skill, this is what we mean by a human capability, and this is how we're going to leverage competencies, which are typically combinations of both, to best serve our business priorities.
Sounds right. So a more customized approach based on the company, the culture, the industry, things like that.
Right. The
wow,
data
great.
will follow from there.